The wind howled through the towering crystal trees of Velthera as soft blue snowflakes fell from the violet sky. The night was quiet except for the occasional chime of distant bells carried by the wind, an eerie yet beautiful sound that made young Exilra shiver with excitement. It was the season of the Great Frost, a time when the twin moons shone their brightest and stories of ancient legends were told around the glowing hearthstones. The elders spoke of many myths, but none fascinated Exilra more than the tale of Santa Claus, the strange figure from a distant death world called Earth. Unlike the terrifying warlords and conquerors that death worlds were known for, Santa was different. He traveled the stars in a mysterious red craft, delivering gifts to the young and bringing joy instead of fear. It didn't make sense. How could someone from such a dangerous world be a bringer of kindness? How could he defy the cold, the distance, and the impossible task of reaching every child? Zilra had heard these stories many times, but no one had ever seen him. Tonight, they would. Zilra's heart pounded as they crept toward the high ridge overlooking the frozen valley. Something had fallen from the sky, a streak of red light, vanishing behind the mountains beyond their village. The elders dismissed it as a comet, but Exilra knew better. They had seen the way it moved, the way it slowed, as if it was not falling but landing. And deep inside, they felt a strange certainty that no one else seemed to have. It had to be him. Santa had come to Velthara. The idea was absurd, yet thrilling. If Santa was real, if he truly existed beyond the myths, then what else could be true? Could a being from a death world really hold such power yet choose to be gentle? And if he had arrived, why had he come here? Silra needed to know. Snow crunched beneath Exilra's feet as they hurried down the narrow path, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The village lights were far behind now, leaving only the glow of the twin moons to guide the way. The wind had grown sharper, carrying a scent that did not belong to Velthara, a scent of something foreign, something unknown. As Exilra moved closer to the valley, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Then, they saw the base of the frozen waterfall, half buried in the snow, stood an enormous red and white structure, unlike anything Exilra had ever seen. It was smooth, metallic, and humming softly, exuding a warmth that melted the snow around it. Strange symbols were painted along its curved surface, and the air around it shimmered as if reality itself struggled to contain its presence. Zilra's throat went dry. A ship. But not just any ship. It matched the descriptions from the old stories. It was his ship. Zilra's first instinct was to run. This was something beyond their understanding, something that should not exist outside of myths. But curiosity held them in place. If they left now, they would never know the truth. Slowly, cautiously, they stepped forward, their gaze locked on the strange vessel. The hum grew louder, and with a soft hiss, a section of the ship opened. A wave of warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of something sweet and spiced, like the roasted nectar fruits their elders made during festivals. Silra barely had time to register the warmth before a shadow moved inside. And then he stepped out. The figure was massive, far taller than any Velthari, his broad frame wrapped in a thick red coat lined with white fur. His face was hidden beneath a heavy snow-white beard, and his eyes, impossibly bright and twinkling, held a wisdom far beyond the years of any being Exilra had ever known. But what struck Exilra most was not his size or the way he radiated warmth against the cold. It was the way the air around him felt different, as if reality itself bent slightly in his presence. The stories spoke of magic, but Exilra had never believed them. Until now. The ground vibrated slightly as the being took another step, the snow beneath his boots not crunching, but simply sinking, as if it dared not resist him. He glanced around, his gaze sweeping the landscape, then lifted a large metal box from the ship's interior with one hand, as effortlessly as if it were made of air. Silra's mind raced. This was no ordinary traveler. This was a Deathworlder, a being from one of the most dangerous planets known to exist. The myths described Earth as a place where creatures hunted each other, where the environment itself was a constant battle for survival. A place where only the strongest, most adaptable beings could endure. And yet, This man was smiling. Zilra remained frozen, unsure whether to step forward or flee. But before they could decide, the figure turned and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The warmth of the ship's lights flickered against the endless cold, casting long shadows in the snow. Zilra's heart pounded so hard they thought it might burst. But the being Santa Claus, the Death Worlder of legend, did not look angry or surprised. Instead, his smile widened. Then, in a voice impossibly deep yet strangely comforting, he spoke. "Well now, what do we have here?" Zilra couldn't breathe. The words were spoken in perfect Velthari, smooth and natural, as if he had lived among them his whole life. It was impossible. No human had ever set foot on their world before. And yet, here he was, speaking their language, standing before them as if he had always belonged. Zilra took a step back, their mind racing. But something in Santa's expression held them in place. There was no hostility, no threat, only warmth, patience, and something else. Understanding. As if he had seen this reaction 1,000 times before. As if he knew exactly what Zilra was feeling. The box in Santa's hand shifted slightly, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached inside. Zilra tensed, every instinct screaming to flee. But when Santa pulled out the object, Zilra's breath caught in their throat. It was a gift, wrapped in shimmering silver paper, tied with a simple red ribbon. Santa chuckled softly and held it out. "Go on," he said, voice deep and steady. "It's for you." Zilra didn't move. Their entire world had just changed, their beliefs shattered in a single moment. This was not a dream. This was real. Santa Claus was real. The stories were real. And if that was true, then perhaps everything else was too. Their hand trembled as they reached for the gift. The legend of the Death Worlder had come to life, and Zilra was standing at the edge of something far greater than they had ever imagined. Somewhere in the distance, the bells chimed once more. Zilra's hands trembled as they stared at the wrapped gift in Santa's massive hand. The silver paper gleamed under the soft glow of the twin moons, the red ribbon tied into a neat bow, almost too perfect to touch. This was not just a simple object, it was proof. Proof that the ancient stories were true. Proof that a Death Worlder had set foot on Velthara, standing right in front of them, offering a gift as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. But nothing about this moment was ordinary. Every fiber of Zilra's being told them to run, to get as far away from this impossible figure as possible. And yet, their feet remained planted in the snow, their wide, unblinking eyes locked onto his. Santa's face, partially hidden beneath his thick white beard, held no trace of anger or impatience. His eyes, impossibly bright and warm, studied Zilra with a kind of gaze that saw more than just the physical form. It was a gaze that understood, one that carried the weight of countless years of knowing things others could not comprehend. The wind howled across the valley, kicking up spirals of glimmering frost. But Santa did not move, as if the cold itself dared not touch him. Zilra's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This being was a legend, a figure from stories meant to entertain children. Yet here he stood, real and breathing, his presence bending reality itself. Zilra had spent their whole life believing that Death Worlders were dangerous, that their existence was defined by violence, survival, and war. Everything the galaxy knew about Earth painted it as a place where life was a struggle, where only the strongest endured. And yet, here was a Death Worlder who did not bring war, but gifts. Who did not conquer, but traveled the stars to give. It was too much to understand all at once. A sudden, terrifying thought crossed Zilra's mind. What if this was a trick? What if Santa was not what he seemed? The stories spoke of his kindness, but they had also spoken of his power, and power could be used for many things. Zilra glanced at the massive red ship behind him, its hull pulsing with a soft, unnatural glow. No Velthari technology could compare to this. If Santa wanted to take over their world, who could stop him? Who could stop a Death Worlder that could defy the very laws of nature? Their throat tightened at the thought, but still, Santa did not move. He simply held the gift out, waiting, as if he had all the time in the universe. Zilra swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. The snow crunched softly beneath their feet. Santa's expression didn't change, but there was something in his posture, something calm and patient, as if he understood exactly what was going through Exilra's mind. The legend said he had traveled to countless worlds, met millions of children across the stars. How many times had he seen this reaction? How many had stood before him, afraid yet unable to turn away? The thought sent a shiver down Exilra's spine. They reached out, their fingers brushing against the smooth silver wrapping. A jolt of warmth spread through their fingertips, surprising them. It wasn't the artificial heat of machinery or the warmth of body temperature, it was something deeper, something that felt alive. Zilra's breath hitched as they slowly took the gift, their hands still trembling. Santa let go, his smile never fading, as if he had just passed on something far more important than a simple present. Zilra looked down at the box, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. For a long moment, they simply stared, unsure what to do. Then slowly, they lifted their gaze back to him. Why? The question slipped out before Exilra could stop it. Their voice was barely above a whisper, lost beneath the howling wind, yet Santa seemed to hear it perfectly. His smile widened slightly, as if he had been expecting the question. "Because that's what I do," he said, his deep voice carrying a warmth that somehow cut through the icy air. "Because someone has to remind the universe that kindness still matters." Zilra's heart pounded. That answer didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. The galaxy was a cruel place. Worlds fought for resources, species waged wars for dominance, and survival was never guaranteed. Strength was what ruled the stars, not kindness. And yet, this being had defied it all. He had traveled beyond the borders of logic, bringing warmth to places that had never known it. And he had come here, to Velthera, to them. Zilra's fingers tightened around the gift as a strange feeling welled up inside them, something between fear and awe. Santa stepped back, his massive boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. "You should go home now," he said, his voice still gentle but firm. "It's cold." Zilra barely heard him. Their mind was still reeling, trying to process the impossible truth standing before them. But one thought kept returning, one terrifying realization that refused to leave. If the myths were true, if Santa Claus was real, then what else was real? What other stories had they dismissed as simple legends? What other secrets did the universe hold? They opened their mouth to speak, to ask 100 different questions, but before they could utter a single word, the wind shifted. The air crackled, charged with something unseen. Santa took another step back, and suddenly, the ground beneath him did not hold his weight. Zilra's breath caught in their throat as he began to rise, his body lifting off the snow as if the very laws of gravity no longer applied to him. The ship behind him rumbled softly, and the open entrance began to close, the warm golden light fading into the cold night. Santa's red coat billowed as he floated higher, his massive form becoming an outline against the backdrop of the twin moons. Zilra stumbled back, gripping the gift tightly, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was not technology. This was not something any species in the galaxy had ever seen. This was something else. Something beyond understanding. Santa hovered for a moment, looking down at them one last time. His eyes twinkled with something ancient, something timeless. And then, with a final, knowing smile, he simply said, "Merry Christmas." The wind roared, the snow swirled, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Zilra stood in the silence, their breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The valley was empty once more. The ship had vanished, the footprints erased by the wind. It was as if he had never been there. And yet, the gift in Exilra's hands was solid and real, its warmth still lingering in their fingers. They stared at the spot where he had been, heart pounding in their chest. The stars above shimmered, cold and distant, unaware of the impossible moment that had just passed. But Exilra knew. They had seen him. They had met him. And nothing in the universe would ever be the same again. The children of Earth believed Santa Claus was a kind, magical old man who brought gifts once a year. They imagined him riding a sleigh, guided by reindeer, delivering presents down chimneys, with a hearty laugh and a twinkle in his eye. It was a harmless, joyful myth, meant to bring warmth and happiness. But myths were often born from something far older, something far deeper than people could ever comprehend. And the truth about Santa was nothing like the stories told. Deep in the cold void of space, beyond the reach of human eyes, a ship of immense size and power drifted silently. It was ancient, far older than humanity itself, its hull bearing the marks of centuries spent traversing the galaxy. It was not made of metal, nor did it operate on any technology known to mankind. It pulsed with a deep red glow, as if alive, as if watching. Inside, in the very heart of the vessel, stood a figure unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. He was massive, towering over any human, his form covered in a deep crimson cloak that seemed to move like flowing liquid. His beard, long and white, shimmered with an unnatural glow, and his eyes, those eyes held a knowledge that stretched across countless civilizations, across thousands of years. He was Santa. But he was not human. He never had been. The truth was far more unsettling. Santa Claus was not a man delivering gifts. He was a guardian, a being assigned to observe and test the civilizations that reached a certain stage of development. His purpose was never about spreading joy. It was about something much larger, something far beyond the comprehension of the children who eagerly awaited him every year. The act of delivering presents was only a fragment of his true mission, a ritual meant to assess, to watch, to decide. From the very beginning, Santa had traveled to young civilizations, slipping into their myths and stories, allowing them to believe in him, to welcome him. But the gifts he left behind were not mere toys. They were markers, silent beacons that embedded themselves within the world, sending back information, tracking the progress of the species. Every chimney he descended, every letter he received, every wish whispered into the night, it was all part of the test. A test that determined whether humanity was ready for the next step or if they would be marked for something far darker. And tonight, Santa's ship had returned to Earth once more. Inside, a small house in a quiet neighborhood, a young boy named Daniel lay awake in his bed. His eyes, wide with excitement, stared at the ceiling as he listened carefully to the world outside his room. He'd always wanted to see Santa with his own eyes, to prove that he was real. He had heard the stories, watched the movies, read the books. But something deep inside him always felt like there was more to it. Tonight, he had made up his mind he would not sleep. He would stay awake and watch. Minutes stretched into hours, and just as Daniel felt himself losing the battle to exhaustion, he heard it. A sound, soft yet heavy, like the shifting of a great weight. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly sat up. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The house was silent. But he knew something was here. Moving cautiously, Daniel slid out of bed, his small feet making no noise against the floor. He crept toward the door, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. As he reached the edge of the hallway, his eyes darted to the living room, where the Christmas tree stood tall and bright, its ornaments glinting softly in the dim light. And there, standing in front of the fireplace, was a shadow. It was huge. Bigger than any man Daniel had ever seen. The shape was unmistakable: broad shoulders, long cloak, the faint outline of a beard that seemed to shimmer like mist. The boy's breath hitched. Santa. But something was wrong. The figure did not move like an old man leaving presents. It stood still, unnaturally still, as if listening to something unseen. And then, without warning, it turned. Daniel's entire body froze. The moment Santa's gaze met his, a strange sensation flooded his mind, a pressure, a weight that was not physical but something deeper, something that touched his very thoughts. It was as if Santa was looking through him, seeing everything he had ever done, every thought he had ever had. His knees trembled, and for the first time, he understood. The Santa in the stories, the laughing, jolly figure with a sack full of gifts, was a lie. This was something else. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then Santa spoke. His voice was not loud, Not booming, but it echoed in Daniel's head, each word sinking into his bones like whispers from something far beyond human understanding. You are awake. Daniel could not move. He could barely breathe. Santa took a step forward, and with it, the air changed. It felt thicker, charged with something unseen. His crimson cloak billowed slightly, though there was no wind, and the light from the Christmas tree seemed to dim, as if retreating from his presence. I see you, he said softly, his voice both gentle and terrible. I see what you are. What you will become. Daniel's mind spun. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break the moment, but his body refused to obey. His eyes flickered to the floor where the wrapped presents lay. They were not ordinary gifts. He knew that now. They had never been. Santa bent slightly. Go back to bed, Daniel. The boy gasped as his body was released from the invisible grip. He stumbled backward, his legs shaking, and without thinking, he obeyed. He ran back to his room, slammed the door shut, and dove beneath his covers, his heart hammering so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying, hoping that when he woke up, this would all be a dream. But as sleep finally claimed him, the last thing he heard was the soft echo of a voice not in his ears, but in his mind. You have been marked. And far above, beyond the clouds, beyond the sky, the great red ship silently drifted, waiting, watching, because the test had begun. The galaxy had always believed that humanity was weak. They were a young species, reckless, fragile, and insignificant compared to the ancient empires that had ruled the stars for millennia. The Galactic Union tolerated them, allowing them a place among the lesser races, but they never truly respected them. Humans were seen as unpredictable, primitive creatures who relied too much on emotion and instinct, rather than logic and tradition. But that was before the war. That was before the invasion. That was before the galaxy learned the truth about humanity. It began with the arrival of the Zorvath Dominion, a race of conquerors who had crushed countless civilizations beneath their might. Their fleets, vast and merciless, descended upon the outer colonies of the Galactic Union without warning. Worlds fell in days, their defenses torn apart, their people enslaved or exterminated. The Union panicked, their leaders scrambling for a response, but the Zorvath were relentless, their war machine unstoppable. The ancient empires, who had once ruled with arrogance, now cowered before the tide of destruction. And yet, among the chaos, one species did not retreat. One species did not surrender. Humanity fought back. The first battle was on the colony of Epsilon Prime. The Zorvath expected an easy victory, just as they had on a dozen other worlds. They sent a fleet of warships, their soldiers ready to slaughter and subjugate. But instead of terrified civilians begging for mercy, they found something else. Something they had never encountered before. A resistance that did not break. The humans did not have the technology of the older races. They did not have the powerful fleets or advanced weapons of the Union. But what they had was something far more dangerous. They had willpower. They had rage. They had the unbreakable spirit of a species that refused to die. The battle for Epsilon Prime lasted 6 days. The Zorvath lost 3 entire divisions to human guerrilla tactics. They destroyed the cities, expecting the humans to surrender. But instead, the humans fought from the ruins, using every piece of rubble, every destroyed vehicle, every shattered building as a weapon. They turned the entire planet into a battlefield where every street, every shadow, every breath was a trap. The Zorvath had faced resistance before, but they had never fought an enemy who would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. And then came the turning point. A single event that changed everything. The Union, desperate and broken, finally decided to send reinforcements. A fleet was assembled, made up of ships from a dozen different species. But they hesitated. They doubted. The Council feared defeat and refused to commit their full forces. While they debated in their grand halls, humanity took action. A single human warship, SSS Valiant, received a distress call from a nearby colony that was under attack. The logical decision was to retreat. The ship was outnumbered 100 to 1. No reinforcements were coming. But instead of fleeing, instead of accepting defeat, the captain of the Valiant made a choice that no other species would have dared to make. They charged. The Valiant, a lone vessel against an entire fleet, launched itself directly into the heart of the enemy formation. It was not an act of desperation. It was not suicide. It was a message. Humanity did not fear death. Humanity did not bow. If they were going to die, they would take the enemy with them. The battle was brutal. The Valiant weaved through enemy fire, its weapons roaring, its hull burning, but it never stopped. It never slowed. The ship fought like a wounded beast, striking back with everything it had. And then, in one final defiant act, the captain made the ultimate decision. The ship's core was overloaded. The engines were pushed beyond their limits. And as the Zorvath surrounded it, thinking they had finally won, the Valiant detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. A single ship destroyed 20 enemy warships in an instant. The Union forces, watching from afar, could not believe it. No species in the galaxy had ever fought like this. No species had ever sacrificed themselves so willingly, so fearlessly, just to make a point. The Zorvath, for the first time in their existence, hesitated. They had conquered many worlds, crushed many armies, but never had they seen an enemy who embraced death just to ensure their enemy bled more. And that was when the war changed. News of the Valiant spread like wildfire. Across the Union, the other races began to realize the truth. Humanity was not weak. They were not primitive. They were something else. Something terrifying. Something unstoppable. For centuries, the elder races had looked down on humans, mocking them for their emotions, their unpredictability, their reckless nature. But now, they saw it for what it truly was. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology. It was their defiance. One by one, the Union worlds began to rally. Inspired by humanity, they fought back. The once fractured Union became united in a way it had never been before. And at the center of it all were the humans, leading the charge, teaching others what it meant to resist, what it meant to never surrender. The war raged on, but it was no longer a war of conquest. It was a war of survival. And for the first time in history, the Zorvath felt fear. The final battle came sooner than anyone expected. The human-led coalition struck at the heart of the Zorvath dominion, bringing the fight to their own worlds. The battle was brutal, the cost was high, but in the end, the impossible happened. The Zorvath, the mighty empire that had once been unstoppable, was defeated. Their fleets were broken, their worlds liberated, and humanity, the species they had once dismissed, had led the charge that shattered their empire. When the war was finally over, the galaxy was forever changed. The Galactic Union, once a fractured alliance of fearful races, had been reforged into something stronger. And at its center, the species that had saved them all stood tall. No longer were humans seen as weak. No longer were they underestimated. The galaxy now understood the truth. Humanity was not just another species. Humanity was the fire that refused to be extinguished. Humanity was the power that turned fear into courage. Humanity was unstoppable. The snow fell silently over the small town, covering the streets in a soft white blanket. The air was cold, crisp, and filled with the distant laughter of children playing outside. Inside a small, dimly lit shop at the edge of town, an old man sat behind the counter, his hands resting on a wooden box that had remained unopened for many years. His name was Mr. Alden. His shop was filled with strange objects, old trinkets, forgotten relics, and antiques that seemed to carry a story of their own. But among all the things he owned, this box was different. This box was special. It was a gift, one that had never been given. That night, as the town prepared for the festival, a young boy named Thomas walked into the shop. He was no older than 10, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his eyes filled with the innocent curiosity of a child. He had passed by this shop many times before, but had never dared to enter. Something about it had always seemed different. But tonight, something pulled him in. He wasn't sure why, But his feet had led him through the door, past the creaky wooden floor, and straight to the counter where Mr. Alden sat. The old man looked up, his deep blue eyes locking onto the boy's. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice both quiet and heavy with meaning, he asked, "What is it you seek, young one?" Thomas hesitated, unsure of what to say. He hadn't come looking for anything in particular. And yet, as his gaze drifted across the shop, past the countless forgotten items, it landed on the box. His small fingers reached out instinctively, hovering over the smooth, dark wood. "What's inside?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Alden's expression did not change. "That," he said slowly, "is a gift. A gift beyond measure." The boy frowned. "Then why is it still here?" The old man let out a breath, his fingers tracing the edges of the box. "Because no one has been able to open it." Silence filled the shop. The boy's eyes widened as he studied the box more closely. It had no locks, no visible seams, no keyhole. It was perfectly sealed, as if it had never been meant to open. "Have you tried?" Alden nodded. "Many have." Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. There was something. The boy hesitated, then placed his hands gently on the wood. The surface was smooth, unnaturally so, as if time itself had never touched it. He pressed his fingers along the edges, searching for any kind of opening, but found none. It was impossible. And yet, the moment his hands fully rested upon it, something changed. A soft hum filled the air, barely noticeable, but unmistakably real. The shop seemed to grow darker, the candlelight flickering, the very walls holding their breath. And then, to Thomas's utter astonishment, the box began to shift. The wood moved like liquid, the surface rippling as if awakening from a deep sleep. A faint glow pulsed from within, golden and warm, spilling through the cracks that had not been there moments ago. The boy's breath caught in his throat as the lid slowly lifted, revealing nothing. The box was empty. Thomas blinked in confusion. After all the mystery, after all the anticipation, there was nothing inside. Just darkness. He looked up at Mr. Alden, who remained silent, watching him with an expression that was neither surprised nor disappointed. "I don't understand," Thomas murmured. "You said it was a gift." The old man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "And it is." The boy frowned, staring at the empty box. "But there's nothing here." Mr. Alden leaned forward slightly. "Are you sure?" Thomas looked again. He squinted, as if hoping to see something hidden in the shadows of the wooden interior. But there was nothing. No treasure, no trinket, no secret object waiting to be revealed. Only emptiness. And yet a strange warmth filled his chest, a feeling unlike anything he had ever known. It was as if the box was not just empty, but waiting. A thought, no, a memory surfaced in his mind. A moment from years ago, one he had nearly forgotten. His mother's laughter as she hugged him on a cold winter morning. His father's hand on his shoulder, reassuring and strong. The way his sister had shared her favorite toy with him when he was sad. It was not the box that held something. It was him. Mr. Alden's voice was gentle as he spoke. The greatest gift is not gold or jewels, nor power or fame. It is something that cannot be seen, cannot be held, but is always felt. It is what you carry inside you. Understanding dawned in Thomas's young eyes. The box had never been meant to hold something physical. It was a test, a mirror, a key that did not open a lock, but a realization. He looked at the old man, his heart pounding with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "It's me?" Alden smiled for the first time. "Yes." The box, as if satisfied, let out one final pulse of light before slowly sealing itself once more, its surface smoothing over until it was as it had been before. Thomas withdrew his hands, feeling lighter as if something inside him had shifted. He looked up at Mr. Alden, who nodded approvingly. "Not everyone understands," the old man said. "But you do." The boy exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air of the shop. The gift had been given, even though it could never be wrapped, never be touched. It was the most valuable thing in the world. It was who he was. As Thomas turned to leave, stepping back into the snowy streets of the town, he felt different, changed. The laughter of children sounded clearer, the glow of the festival lights warmer. He looked around at the people, his friends, his family, and for the first time he understood. A gift beyond measure was not something that could be held. It was something that lived inside. Something that, once discovered, could never be taken away. As the shop door closed behind him, Mr. Alden leaned back in his chair, watching the snowfall outside. The box remained on the counter, silent and waiting for the next soul ready to receive the greatest gift of all.